Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
And in today's episode, we're going to talk about a topic that is very dear to my heart, which is coverstitching, a very particular machine that you use primarily to hem stretchy fabrics. And Malena, why is a coverstitch useful?
As you said, it's when you want to hem knitted fabrics, it gives a really stretchy seam, and it's really pretty, really beautiful compared to if you sew with your regular home sewing machine. So that is the big advantage, the stretchiness of the seam.
Yeah, absolutely. You can achieve it similar with the twin needle on a sewing machine. But the advantage of using a coverstitch machine is primarily also that it has the differential feed lever, which means that you can regulate the speed of the feed dogs, meaning that can prevent the fabric from stretching out, which it can be a problem if you're hemming very soft and supple knits on your sewing machine, that the feeding and the pressure from the presser foot can stretch out the fabric when you're hemming, so you can get this wavy, like almost stretched out seam if you don't use the right methods, and if the fabric is very difficult. And the advantage of a coverstitch machine, just like a serger, to me, is the fact that you can actually control the speed and keep the fabric in check. So even on very soft, stretchy fabrics, you can still have the fabric to lie flat due to the differential feed. So that's one of the perks of having a coverstitch machine, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely, and it's it gives a really nice look when you wear it. How long have you been having your machine? When did you get it?
I bought my first coverstitch machine. I think it's almost 20 years, so it's probably time for celebration. Woohoo! So I can tell you the backstory. Why I purchased one is that I was part of a sewing group, that we had a sewing meetup every week, and one of the fellow sewists she was sewing a lot of t-shirts, and her hems looked so beautiful, and I wasn't able to achieve that using the twin needle on my sewing machine. So I asked her, and I don't really think I quite knew what a coverstitch machine was back then. It wasn't like a famous household product. And so I was like, what tricks did you use on your sewing machine to get such a beautiful hem? And she was like, oh, but I have this. And then she showed me a FUF combination machine, which was common back in the days. It was a serger and a coverstitch in the same. So you did a switch. And these machines, you can still get them, but today it's more common with standalone machine. And I was like, wow, that became like my dream machine, because I've always sewn a lot with knits, but when she showed me that and compared to what I could achieve on the sewing machine, it was like I realized I really, really wanted to have one, and they are quite expensive. And back then I didn't have a steady job. I was as a journalist, but I only had like temp jobs, various temp jobs. But I got a really nice check for a freelance job, and then I got the cheapest combination machine, and I think that was in 2004. So yeah, it's a 20-year celebration today, not but today, maybe this year.
So wow, that's good. But you said your first, yeah. Yes, you have more.
No, yes, of course. As we all know who love to sew, you can always have another machine. But yeah, I stuck it out with the combination machine. That was the budget version. My sewing friend, she has a more higher end FUF machine, and I had the cheaper one, but it was still quite expensive. It was called FUF Cover Style. And to be honest, it wasn't that great to hem with. It was a really good serger, but as a coverstitch machine, and it also was very time consuming to do all the switching between cover stitching and sergers. You have to reset a lot of things and do rethreading and everything. So I was a little bit sick of it, and so I think I bought my second cover stitch machine in, let me see here, I must have been like 9 or 10 years ago. So then I got a Janome 2000, which is one of the more common cover stitch machine back then, and also one of the few that were readily available here in Sweden. So I was also told back then that the Baby Lock do a better cover stitch machine, but it was out of my price range again. Then I had at that point I did have a steady job as a journalist, but it was extremely low paying, so I could barely pay the bills anyway. So that's how I ended up getting my second cover stitch machine, which I still have today. And I'm definitely thinking about doing upgrade in the future, which I think we're going to talk about, because there are a few different type of cover stitch machines. So, but mine now is a standalone, and I would say it's a decent machine, but I wouldn't say it's an A++ machine. So, but you also have a cover stitch machine, right, Malena?
Yeah, I got one it wasn't that long ago. It was like maybe 4.5 something years ago. And I bought it. It's a Singer machine. And if you're watching the video, you can actually see it here in the background. And I haven't used it that much, to be honest. I basically only use it to hem knitted tops, and I also used it like once or twice to do, because you can have different amount of needles. So you can have, when you hem it, you usually have 2 needles, and then you can also have just 1 needle, which is very nice when you do a top stitch on a neckline. So I've used that a few times. I'm okay with the machine. Like, it's not. It's more of a budget buy. I'm a little bit disappointed in myself that I didn't actually buy a Bernina. I'm a hardcore Bernina fan, always. I love their overlock. So I'm a little bit like, I should have bought the Bernina coverlock instead, but it was a bit more expensive as well. And since I don't sew for a living or anything, like I don't use it that much, so I was like, I can't spend that much money on a machine that I'm not going to use so much. Like, the Singer is fine, it's good enough. The thing that I don't like about it is when you put your foot on the pedal and, well, you gas, it's like nothing happens, and then all of a sudden the machine is like running. So it's like you don't have that stable sewing speed, and especially when you sew hems, and especially with the necklines, with the shoulder, when you have those really thick layers or many layers of fabric with the shoulder seams and everything, then it's a little bit tricky to actually sew over those humps. So maybe you have some tips or tricks for me here. But otherwise, beside that, it's it's a fine machine. It's not top notch, but it's okay for the amount of times that I use it. I have one of those. I've said this before. I have one of those that you can make a binding as well, but it's still in the box. Never used it.
I don't think you're not alone in that. Also, some people, we should mention that, because the cover stitch do have a lot of different uses. It's just not hemming knits. I think, at least here in Sweden, I think one of the most common reasons why you buy a cover stitch machine is, as you say, to do binding on necklines or sleeve openings, or if you're sewing baby clothes for those, what do you call it, the buttons? Do you know what
yeah,
you
on
call
the bodies,
those?
yeah.
The body's right, yeah. The fastening or the edges, you use it for that as well. So it's very popular here in Sweden to sew clothes for small children, and so a lot of people end up buying a cover stitch for that reason. But yeah, with the attachment, one of the things is that it's a little bit time consuming to set up, and then every time you do it, you have to adjust and make sure that it just hits the right spot in relation to the presser foot and the fabric, and you need to test the stitch settings. So if you just do it once every quarter or even less, it's not that motivating to do all that setup just to put binding on one garment, and then. So I know some people they have the binder on, so they hardly ever use it for hemming, because they just use it for binding, and they just find the perfect setup and then they keep it that way because
I can understand that.
Yes, as we talked about previously, both I and Malena find it difficult even to re-thread a serger, so you can imagine the resistance to setting up the binder attachment if you don't have to. So, yeah, it's definitely a tricky, and you touch on something that I think is that everyone, I think, sooner or later will encounter, even if they buy a premium model of a coverstitch machine, is that it does have some issues. It's a bit more fickle, I would say, compared to a regular sewing machine and a serger, because especially it doesn't really like resistance. So as soon as, if you're sewing over uneven layers or thick layers, those domestic coverstitch machines do have a tendency of not really cooperating. So it usually have, issues with the feeding. So you might end up getting skip stitches or very small stitches because it doesn't feed properly. So there are lots of different ways, and I think that's one of the more common issues. And I always say that first of all, you have to try to flatten out everything as much as you possibly can. So for instance, if you're sewing over you're top stitching a neckband, for instance, you're sewing over the neckline, one tip that we talk about, and you will also see in the garment industry, is that you don't place the seam of the neckband at the shoulder seam. Instead, you move the seam a little bit back towards the neck. That not just that it looks less visible that way, it also minimize there's less things to bump over when you're sewing, so there are less problems, because then you will have the seam allowance of the neckband will not touch the shoulder seam. So if you're stitching close on the fabric, there's no risk of that extra layer, because every time it's a little bit uneven or thicker, it's gonna most coverstitch machine will object to that particular unfortunately. So that's one trick. And I also like to use the what we sometimes call a hump jumper or a height level tool. So for instance, if you're sewing over those bulky layers, just like you would on a regular sewing machine, you can insert a little bit piece of plastic that will level out the presser foot, and then it will keep straight, and that will help with the feeding, because usually when the presser foot has to go up and down, that's when it's gonna struggle. It's like, you think of it, if you're going to bike uphill, and it's gonna be harder. It's the same for a sewing machine, and just like a regular sewing machine, the coverstitch does have a tendency to struggle over those areas. So I think you should try to minimize bulk as much as you can. That's why it's usually easier to hem fabrics than doing top stitching over many layers with a coverstitch machine. That's one of the good things to know when you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing to also have always, I think, in mind. When we make clothes, of course we always want to have things symmetrical because it just feels nice in our soul, but we really avoiding the thickness is actually more beneficial than to having the seam allowance always be pressed in the same directions or laying on top of each other. For example, I always recommend when you hem a t-shirt that you cut just a few millimeters, just a little bit in the seam allowance, and then you press the hem that you actually will be folding up. That seam allowance you press in the other direction, so the seam allowance will not be on top of each other. They will actually lay next to each other's, because then
in
it
opposite direction. Yeah, so it's
exactly
flatten out. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is actually quite a good thing to have in mind, that it's actually almost better to have them in the opposite directions in several different places, to be honest, because then you avoid those humps when you sew, and it could also be a little bit uncomfortable when you wear that all of a sudden it's one spot, it has a lot of thick layers. So in this case, forget a little bit about the symmetry. And also, for example, for the neckline, the rib attachment that I always have in my sewing patterns, then I always recommend that, yes, you sew together the neckband first, and those seam allowance, the cut, you place it just below, a few centimeters from the shoulder seam. So it's not on top of the shoulder seam, because then it again will be too much layers. So you just place it a little bit like behind it on the back neckline. Because then it also won't be so visible. If you place it at center back, which you of course can do, that's like perfectly fine as well. It's just going to be a little bit more visible. So that's a bit more like preferences, like how do you want to do it. But as a general rule, try to not place it that seam at the shoulder seam, because then it will be extra layers again. So those kind of small things that even if it's not like specifically for a cover lock now, those are like general things I would say when sewing with knits and woven in some cases as well.
Yeah, it's a very good it's a very good rule. And if you check garments made in the garment industry, you will find these type of methods that we are talking about. And of course, if you get our patterns for knit tops, you will see these in the instructions as well. And we also show step by step what Malena is talking about in our book Fit for Knits, where we have a whole section dedicated to just attaching the neckband and all the things you have to consider when you're doing that, and also if you want to top stitch the neckband afterwards on the fabric. So just those little things. And I was going to give you a tip that I go more into detail in my, because I have not just written a book about cover stitching. I've also done a course called Cover Stitch Success, and I will link to that course in the description section of this video. And by the way, if you want, you can get 20% off this course if you use the code POD20, which is POD20. Again, links will be in the description section, information there, but and over at thelaststitch.com you can find the course. And I also show a thing there which can be helpful when you're sewing over bumpy lace, and that is to either increase the differential feed a little bit when you hit those side seams, for instance, which you're talking about, Malena, where you folded up seam allowance, because that will speed up the feed dogging and will also create slightly longer stitch length. And the same is another option you can try is just to increase the stitch length, because you're just like when you're sewing over thicker fabrics, you're always instructed to increase the stitch length because, you know, the fabric eats up more thread. So what I do nowadays, which I go more into detail in this course, is that I, just before I hit those bumpy seam areas, I just crank up the stitch length a little bit, or the differential feed, and that it in itself has made a huge difference for me, because it just gives a and then, you know, as soon as you hit that past that bumpy area, you revert back to your original settings. So don't be afraid to change the settings during stitching, because I found that this has helped me a lot with preventing skip stitches, which can also happen when the cover stitch isn't like flat all the time. That's usually where these skip stitches occur as well, because it doesn't get like contact and proper feeding with the fabric.
Oh, that's a really, really good tip. I never thought about or tried that one. I will definitely do it next time. But if we back up, basically I've already told how much I've used my cover stitch. That was my experience about it. It was a couple of hems and a neckline top stitching. You have slightly, I'm being ironic now when I say slightly, more experience about cover stitching. Tell us, what do you have? Yeah. So I can tell you the backstory. Just like we have just shared, we both have a fair share of struggles with our cover stitch machine, and that realization that a cover stitch machine is quite hard to use and it's not intuitive. It's a very different experience from sewing with a sewing machine or even a serger. So what I started to do is that I tried to really like figure out a lot of those common problems and what can be done about it. So I think it all started that I dedicated a long blog post back in the days. I think that was almost 10 years ago now, just to this topic, how to troubleshoot your cover stitch machine. And that soon, and I also talked with a very knowledgeable person here in my hometown, Yvonne, where she shared lots of her tips. And so that post just, you know, got bigger and bigger, and it quickly became my most read blog post, because it turned out that there weren't that much content about how to properly sew with the cover stitch machine, and it wasn't really covered in any sewing books either. And there were a couple of blog posts here and there, but not that much content. It didn't really address the troubles that you could have with the cover stitch machine. It was just instructive on how to use it. So
that's how it all started. And then I began doing videos on my YouTube channel about cover stitching, and they soon became my most viewed videos. So clearly, you and I aren't the only people that has had issues and perhaps found it a little bit overwhelming. So that's the backstory of it. And then I realized that, when I published my first book, Sewing Activewear, I had a section dedicated to cover stitching, and several people said, "Oh, so nice to finally have a book that addresses cover stitching." So I thought, well, why not do an entire book about cover stitching? So that's how it all started, and I made the book, which I have in my hands now. If you're watching the video version, it's called Master the Cover Stitch Machine, and this was published in 2019, so it's going on 5 years now, and it's still my best-selling book. So I think I've sold over 10,000 copies of this book, and it's also in a German version as well if you're German-speaking. And you can get it everywhere on Amazon and as an ebook over at my shop at The Last Stitch. And that was a real game changer. And I just realized that there were so many people really wanting to learn more about cover stitching. And this book is both about how to use it properly and also with lots of illustrated tutorials, like step-by-step tutorials on how to do everything that we're talking about now, the binding and it also, like, if you don't have, I'm showing the book now if you're wondering. So it's as you can see, it's a very illustrated book with step-by-step instructions, and both on how to do binding without a binding attachment or without. And now I'm showing a page where you can see other uses, because a cover stitch machine is not just about sewing with knits. You can use it for a lot of other things as well, because it has several different stitches. So I also show how you can use it when you're sewing jeans. For instance, doing the belt loops, because if you look at belt loops, jeans where you bought in a store, you will see it's actually done with the cover stitch machine, which I don't think everyone knows if they haven't checked. And also you can hem at least lighter weight denim using the chain stitch or the single needle stitch in a cover stitch machine. That's also a similar stitch that you will find in ready-to-made jeans. So if you really dive deep into cover stitching, you will find that you can actually do more than just hem with it. So that's it's really, really fun to just do the book, because I had to go outside my own comfort zone, because just like you, I had primarily used it for hemming before. So it was also lots and lots of research on my behalf to figure out how to use it for all these other purposes.
Oh, wow, yeah, that sounds, it's, when you start thinking of it, you realize that, you can do so many things in there with the cover stitch. That's really cool. I have not seen your book, to be honest, so it was really fun to see some snippets from it.
Remind me that I have to send you a copy. Sorry, Malena. But do you mean you haven't bought my book? Sorry.
I mean, it's on the way. It's on the way.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So now it's bad vibes in the pod. Sorry. No, I feel bad because I should have sent you a copy. I didn't think about that because I have a stash here in my office. So no worries, I'm going to get the book for you. So that's something it was a really eye-opening way for me, and it also made me approach cover stitching in a different way, because I had also felt some resistance due to all the issues that one can encounter. Even when I was using, I was always like deep sigh before, so what's gonna go wrong this time? But when I did the book and beforehand that with the videos and the blog post as well, I kind of did it like more experimental, like investigative, like discovery approach to cover stitching, and that has really helped me to enjoy using the machine much more, because I can now see that it's a lot of it is just understanding and do tiny tweaks. Another tip that I don't think people do enough is to experiment with the presser foot pressure, because again that can also fix some of these issues with feeding and skip stitches and all that kind of stuff. So to me now I feel more like, okay, so now we're going to see what can I do this time to prevent issues from happening. So yeah, it's definitely changed my entire approach to cover stitching, just doing this book and learning along the way.
That sounds very inspiring. Maybe we should So what are the different type of seams you can do with the cover stitch? Just so people get if you don't have one, for example, so you know the difference between a home sewing machine and a serger. You can have, for example, you can have 3 different amount of needles, right?
Yes, exactly. So I think today I would say that most standalone cover stitch machine and most combination machine will have 3 needles. So you have, you can either sew with 3 needles, which means that you will have 3 straight stitches on the upper side, and then you will have a looped overlock pattern, you could say, on the reverse side. And what you can do, because that stitch is actually quite beautiful, and it looks similar to what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is called the top cover, which is like a 5-thread cover stitch seam that you can see in ready-to-wear, especially activewear, for instance. But if you call it reverse stitching. So the I think most people don't use, when they use the 3 needles, at least here in Sweden, I think more people actually use it on the reverse side, so they get that decorative loop formation on the right side of the fabric, because it looks really, really nice. You can experimenting with that, and you can use thicker thread in the looper, woolen nylon, for instance, so you can get really nice decorative stitch. So I think to me that is probably one of the selling points of getting a 3-thread.
Yeah, and it's really common to have, for example, if you have a raglan sportswear top or something like that, you have it as a decorative stitch along the seam to hold down the seam allowance, and also it makes the seam much more durable. I mean, it's much more it won't crack that easily.
Yeah, very, very good point as well. Yeah. So you have the 3 needles, and then you can usually, because if you have the 3 needle version, you can choose between having a narrow 2 needle setup, or you can have a wide 2 needle setup. So the wider, I think, is about 1 centimeter, which is about 3/8 of an inch, I think, or maybe less, maybe 6 or 7, but it's quite wide. And then you have the narrow, which I think is just about 4 millimeters, something like that. So you can use it depending on what type of purpose you are using. For instance, if you're doing sewing belt loops, for instance, I would definitely recommend using the wider one. But on some knit garments, and if you're sewing baby clothes, for instance, I think the narrow one is more nice. Which one do you use primarily when you are hemming, Malena? Do you use the narrow one or the wider one?
I always use the wider one. Personal taste, I would say, but also the wider one is a little bit more stretchy, so that's why I always use the wider one. I think it looks nicer, but that's just, again, personal opinion. But for the smaller one, yeah, definitely for baby's clothes or something, the wider one might look a little bit clumsy, maybe. So then the smaller one would be more suitable.
Yeah. And also the good thing is that because you have 3 needles, you can either sew with the outer needle on the left side or on the right side. So depending on the project or what you find is easier, you can also switch around. Sometimes if you're having issues, you might move the outer needle to the inner needle, and you will have less issues as well if you're using the narrow one. So yeah, those all 3 are very good. And the other option is the chain stitch, which I briefly mentioned when I talk about hemming jeans. And so the chain stitch is basically a straight stitch on the right side. You use 1 needle, and then on the reverse side you get this beautiful chain stitching, which you can, for instance, see if you look inside a pair of jeans. If you buy them in stores, you will see the chain on the reverse side. And that also has a little bit of stretch. So if you're sewing, for instance, stretch jeans, I think it's a very good idea, if the fabric isn't too heavy, to actually use the chain stitch, because then you will get a natural stretch, and you will also get a really nice stretch seam. The only thing to know about this, it needs to be secured really properly, which I also show several methods in the book, but otherwise it can unravel. And I know some people use it for basting, because the chain is so easy to remove. So if you just pull from the start, the end point, of the stitch, it just unravels. So there's a pros and cons. The same with the cover stitch, because if you just pull the looper thread from the reverse side where you finish, if you haven't secured it, it's gonna unravel. So you have to always secure a cover stitch seam, which again I show many methods both in the book and in my videos on YouTube, and also of course in my cover stitch course how to secure it. But that's so you have lots of different options, honestly, and we haven't even talked about the attachment then. But yeah, and you could also use the one needle for the top stitching the neckband, for instance, because you get that nice stretch, and it's a little bit more discreet than using 2 needles. So and so you can even sew binding with one needle. So there's lots of different options. I think that if you approach it like that and just don't use it for hemming, I think you will find it more interesting from an investment point of view, because I think I'm sure a lot of you listening now who don't have a cover stitch machine, you will think, why should I? It's so much money to invest in a machine that only do one thing, basically hemming. But if you think outside that opportunity and are prepared to, like, of course, then have to rethread and reconfigure it, but which we all struggle with, as we know. But then you will have so many more options, which I think could perhaps be, a good reason to actually invest in a cover stitch machine if you see other uses that we are talking about in this episode.
Yeah, and it's I'm always gonna say get a serger or overlocker first, because that's you're gonna have much more daily use of that machine. But then as a regular home sewing machine, then a serger, and then a cover stitch machine. So it's not again, I've been sewing my whole life, and I just got a cover lock for 4 years ago. So I managed without it, but yeah, it's definitely my hems are on the next level now. I'm really happy that I bought it. And just to explain the difference when you have a twin needle, then you sew on a regular sewing machine, and the right side is two rows of seams, and the back side is a zigzag. And I usually find this just a tip if you are using a twin needle, have the tension of the thread, especially in the bobbin, the lower thread, have it more loose than you normally do, because otherwise it's just the zigzag is gonna be too tight, it's gonna be pulling, and then the fabric is not gonna lay flat on the right side. It's gonna be like a little bump. It's gonna look like a bump in between those seams.
I think I lost you there.
So it's a little bit.
It's
a little bit tricky to use the twin needle. It's a little bit tricky, so that's why it's you get such a much better result with a cover lock. I say cover lock, cover stitch. Is it which one is
I think
the right one now?
Listeners from various English-speaking countries can of course fill us in on this, but from my understanding, cover stitch is what is said in the US, which is also what I use in my book. Cover lock is more common in the UK and in Australia, and the Swedish version, if we say texsum, but it means cover seam if you would translate it straight. So cover seam machine would be the so
okay, so that's why I'm mixing it up all of the time.
It's like in the UK they say overlock, and we say overlock in Sweden as well. And in the US they say serger, so that's why we keep mixing it up, and we do that in our book as well, Fit for Knits, because serger has become such a ubiquitous word. So that's what most people think about, even though we actually use UK English, because that's what we were taught in school here in Nordic countries. We do mix it up a little bit, because otherwise if we would do the correct UK English, we would say cover lock and overlock. And so we talk about the same thing here when we say serger, overlock, and I think all of you know that we talk about the same machine. And but in a way I think it's when you think about it, because the overlock, it explains what it does. It overlock the edges, and then the serger, that's, I guess, is more that it cuts the fabric, right? It serge along the edges. We're maybe out on very thin ice here. We're trying to figure out why they use two different words for the same machine, even though it's the same language. But so yeah, there's probably a backstory there. But yeah, absolutely. And speaking of a cover, because nowadays, if you are in the market to buy a cover stitch machine, you will also have the option of having a fifth thread. So a normal cover stitch machine with 3 needles have four thread stands, one looper thread on the reverse side, and then 3 stands for the different needles. And now you have what's called usually a top cover machine, which is doing what the professional hemming is. We talked about the reverse side. This top cover machine has a fifth situated for the fifth thread spool, so it's like a second looper thread basically, and that creates the professional finish. So if you go and look on a pair of leggings today that you buy in a store, you will, I would say 9 out of 10 times, not be hemmed with the 2 needle cover stitch. It will be hemmed with this 5 thread cover stitch seam. So there are a couple of brands now that has this top cover function, and that's probably the machine I will get. But I'm kind of holding out because I know that it can be a little bit fickly, and I've tried it and in the research when I did a book, and I found it quite cumbersome to use. So there's definitely a learning curve. I think the machines will improve. I think Brother was the first brand offering it. Now Janome does as well, and I think probably Babylock as well. So probably several different brands have this. So, you know, I'm not saying if you're just buying your first cover stitch machine and you're not like too crazy about the details, I wouldn't buy one of those because, you know, it's a newer machine, so it will probably have more issues. But if you're thinking of reinvesting in a cover stitch machine, I might consider it, just like I'm doing myself. So I will definitely, once I've gotten that machine, I will hopefully do it this year, I will definitely do an episode about that so I can talk about my experience. Hopefully not too bad. But
that machine, how does the seam look? Is it basically the same on the right side and the reverse side then?
Yes, it's similar, yes. So it looks like the flat lock seam. If you buy a garment that is sewn with a flat lock seam, that's the same formation. It just looks like the flat lock seam. And on the reverse side, you see it looks exactly like the 3 needle cover stitch. So it's a different formation. It looks really, really beautiful, but it's a little bit more fickle, yeah.
And speaking of fickle, I guess since you have made a course about issues that you can have with the cover lock, you have noticed a lot of things that can go wrong. Tell us a little bit more about this course. Like, what are the examples that you teach and show there? Yeah, because this is an online course and it's videos, right?
Yes, it's divided into over 20 different chapters, which go into everything that you need to know to both prevent and fix common cover stitch issues. So if you're watching the video version of this, I will actually show you a little bit of the course now on screen. And if you're wondering, you will find the video version on YouTube. So we're going to see here. So I'm just going to show one of the courses here. Section. So it's basically, I go into everything from understanding tension, how to fix tension issues, because tension, of course, you know, is when either the needle thread or the looper thread is uneven, which is a very common problem, especially when you're sewing with tricky fabrics, and I talk about stitch length. So there's basically just short videos on every chapter. For instance, here where I'm showing now on screen, I talk about how to. Another common issue is that you get drag lines and twisted fabric when you're hemming, especially curves. So I show how to prevent those. And we talked about tunneling, that if you're sewing with a twin needle on a sewing machine, you get tunneling, and I show how to prevent that. And skip stitches, of course, that's a long chapter where I have 4 sections, like what causes skip stitches, preventing skip stitches, and I also have, this is my favorite, where I show how to repair skip stitches, because sometimes if you get one skip stitches and you hem the entire garment, you don't want to re-sew everything, right? So you can actually, with a bit of just needle and thread, you can actually repair it so you won't see it. So that's all, some of the things that I figure out along the way. So I show basically step by step how to mend both skip stitches on 2 needle and 3 needle to make it look pretty much invisible. Just
when you get when you are put in difficult situations, you get creative.
Yeah. So yeah, it's basically just very straight to the point. I will try to. I shouldn't use the video here, but I'm gonna show you. You can see if you're watching the press full pressure video version. So realize that the reason why the feeding isn't working is because it's curling, and that is the reason. And I also talk, of course, about the settings and everything like that. So let me see here. So how you adjust the differential feed and everything like that. So it's basically very detailed step by step. So you don't have to watch through the entire thing. You can just skip to that particular chapter, for instance, if you have problems with seams that are unraveling, how to use the binder attachment. Also, of course, if the seam isn't stretched enough, what to do if the fabric is stretched out. So yeah, I have you covered if you pick this, if you get this course, and if you also use the code as I mentioned here. The code is pod 20 that you can just fill in when you're getting the course, and you will get automatically 20% off. So, and that's actually, as I said, I've sold around 10,000 copies of my book Cover Stitch Machine, and also the course is also one of my biggest successes, because I've had I think almost 400 people enrolling in that course, which again goes to show that this is something that we are not the only ones struggling with. And so I'm very, very glad that I made this course and just show all the different ways of doing it. So every step is just a short introduction of me, and then it's just straight to the point, settings with everything like that. So I've gotten a really great response for my students that find the course very, very helpful. And if you don't want to get the course, you can also go over to my my YouTube channel, The Lost Stitch TV, because then I have a playlist, and I'm also going to show, as I mentioned previously here, that I have done a lot of videos on cover stitching, and that's not an exaggeration. So in this playlist, cover stitching, you see I have so much topics, everything from how to hem, how to use the binder attachment, how to fix skip stitches, which tools to use, and all this kind of stuff, and guide to buying different cover stitch machines. So you can start there, of course. If you just want to see if some of the things that you are struggling with, I probably have done a video about it already.
And this course, is it like online based, so you don't download anything, but you have like access to it online all the time then?
Yes, so it's one-time purchase. You buy it, and then you have lifetime access to it. So it's not like a streaming service or anything like that. I won't charge you monthly. It's a one-time fee, and you can watch it over and over again as many times as you like. And I think most people just skip to the particular chapter where they have some issues. So yeah. So that's something I'm very, very proud of. It was my first video course, and I felt, and also I should mention I have so much things about cover stitching. I have like an entire world. If you step into my world of cover stitching, you might never get out of it. But I also have a free downloadable guide that you can get, where I also show some tips on troubleshooting cover stitch, and that link will be in the show notes of this video as well. If you can start there as well, just to learn some tips that will probably help you a lot in the future, because I think everyone has had struggles, and I think it's a really useful guide.
Sounds like you have had a lot of experience with it.
yeah
But it's also so fun to because apparently like there has been a gap in the market. Yeah. Like there have been the machines, but not really like how to use them, and maybe how to use them, but all the problems that can appear and how to actually fix them. So it's really like, as a business owner, you always want to find that niche, like, this is where a gap in the market is. This is where I can do some good, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything is collected basically from my own and other people's experience, and that's also an approach I try to do with lots of things, and that we have also done in our books, addressing very specific problems in our book Fit for Knits, which we're talking about right now, addressing, okay, what are some common issues that you might encounter, and then try to really make it as easy to understand as possible for everyone. I think that's a fun thing about producing content about sewing, because you always find these like underserved areas, because there are always things that people haven't really thought about collecting in a easy to understand manner. So yeah, that's cover stitching is definitely one of those topics, I feel.
Yeah, and now a question. Speaking about the machines, you said that the first one was a combination of overlock and coverlock. Do you recommend those like combination machines, or like are they? Because I always think that when it's a combination of two, neither of them are perfect. Then, would you say that is true, or?
Yeah, I would say that it's true. I think the only exception is the baby lock machines. They are extremely expensive, though. They cost like a decent used car. But the people that are using that kind of combination machines that the baby lock have, they seem to be happy users, and they're also easy to switch. But honestly, I have not met one person, even though they have gotten like good brand combination, even Bernina and which are known to make quality machines. They have had reoccurring issues with these combination machines. So if you don't have the budget of really, getting the top of the line combination machine, I would definitely advise against it, because it's actually cheaper to get. I mean, a serger, for instance, isn't that expensive, and it can do a good job in different price ranges. So I would definitely not buy a combination machine. Just the fact that you have to rethread it, reset it up. I mean, I think
but that's usually like the common thing when you combine two things. It's like, well, then neither of them are gonna be like really, really good.
Yeah.
You can also say that the difference between like a home sewing machine and the industrial machine, then it's also like the industrial machines are even more specific to do one thing, but do it really, really well. So for example, the home sewing machines, like you can have different stitches like straight stitched, zigzag, and all other like hundreds of different decorative stitchings. You don't have that kind of machine in the industry. Then you have like one machine that does only straight stitches, but it goes much faster, or you can even control the speed, and it does that really, really well instead. So that's like you become even more specific in the industry, because then you have one task, one machine, basically. And when it comes to the really big like production sewing lines, then you have like the different machines, different settings, and you don't change the settings when it's done. You just produce them. So that's why you have like so many different machines then in the like industry in the sewing line. So as home sewing people that have that one machine, like we need to adjust and find the different tensions and the different settings for each specific project.
Yeah.
But that looks completely different in the industry.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point, and I think that's probably why we sometimes get a little bit frustrated with our sewing machines, is that we want them to excel in every area, and we have to have like reasonable expectations, and we also don't have a service person at hand that can fix the machines, because also in the industry, they have like trained technicians that just set everything up when you're starting a new project, and make sure everything is right, and then you don't touch anything. And unfortunately, we have to be that person too. So that's very, very important. And also, it's sometimes I do like note down certain settings. For instance, if I'm sewing binding on a cover stitch machine, I always write down my favorite settings, and that really helps as well, because it's just a balance. The press foot pressure, the differential feed, the stitch length. So there are lots of different things that you can adjust to achieve that perfect result. So when you're doing it again, you at least have a baseline, so you don't have to start all over again. I mean, you still have to do samples, but it's just not as bad as trying to start from scratch every time. So I think that's one way of for us to think about it if we don't have the option of having a service person doing all this.
Yeah, but that's a really good tip to actually write down your settings for the different projects. That's a really smart way of doing it, so you don't have to retry everything. Like you have you don't have to start from the first step. You can actually move along a little bit faster.
Yeah, and absolutely. And when I did the book, which you can also find a section about in the book, I visit like a student garment factory setup, which at the school where you studied as well for a while in Borås, the textile university. And those very kind ladies that were retired garment sewing workers, they showed me everything. And I will have to say, it was much nicer to sew with a properly set up industrial machine. And one thing I loved about the hemming machine was that it, with just a click on the pedal, it also secured the stitch. So you didn't have to do the pull or secure the thread or anything just that. You just pressed a second time on the pedal and it pulled the thread on the reverse side. And then you're just like, wow. So that was one of those. And of course, they had one machine just for binding. But they did say that every time they change material or change thread, they have to reconfigure it again. So when I was sewing it the first time, they hadn't properly configured for that fabric type. So again, I also ended up with skip stitches because it wasn't properly. So it's not like everything works straight out of the box in a garment factory as well. It just, as Malena says, it needs to be configured properly, and we have to have a similar approach, I think, as home sewists.
Yeah, definitely, and especially when we sew with knitted fabrics, because they can be so different from each other compared to wovens, since they don't have that stretch function. And the knitted fabric, they can be so thick or thin or soft, hard, like they can be so different. So that's why we also then need to have, of course, different settings when we use the machines. So always, when you cut out your product, always save a little bit like scrap fabric that you have next to your machine. And for every different type of seam that you sew, try out one little test first on the scrap fabric, just to see like everything is proper and it looks nice. That I really recommend.
Yeah, we should probably end every single episode that we're doing about sewing. Always do a sample. That should be like our. I think we mention this every time, and I've just recorded several YouTube videos where I talk about sewing knits, especially with the regular sewing machine. And I started when I rewatched them because I think I was saying always do a sample at least 2 or 3 times in every video. I was like, I maybe should cut it out. But yeah, it's so true, Malena. That's something we should print T-shirts. That should be our merch for Stitching Tales. Always do a sample.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, I can cut corners here and there. Like I don't want to like. Reveal where I'm cutting corners now, but I do, but not when it comes to testing the machine settings, because the few times that I haven't done it, then the fabric gets stuck in a machine. It like inevitable. When you don't try it out first, then bad things will happen. So that is something that I always do it. Yeah.
And so that's such a good point. And listen to Malena, because she knows what she's talking about. So it's a very good reminder to all of us. So on that end note, we should perhaps end this episode, of course, as if you want to learn more about cover stitching, the links will be in the show notes of this video. And don't forget to get your 20% off on Cover Stitch Success at thelaststitch.com. You will find a link to the course there. POD20 is the code. And of course, my book, Master the Cover Stitch Machine. And on YouTube, you can just search cover stitching on my channel and on the blog as well. There's so much cover stitching.
You cover a lot.
I do. Pun intended. Anyways, thank you so much for listening to us. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.